The report was filed incorrectly. That was the first thing Senior Archivist Vel Soren noticed when the data packet arrived from the Terran Coordination Bureau. Not the content, not the request, not the list of names attached to the transfer manifest. The filing error. A single classification stamp, misapplied. The humans had categorized the deployment under asterisk medical transport rather than combat personnel. Vel Soren almost corrected it without reading further. Almost. It was the footnote that stopped her. A single line, buried beneath 40 pages of biometric clearance codes and interstellar transit authorizations, written in the clinical shorthand that bureaucrats used when they didn't want something to sound like what it was. Subjects are cleared for galactic deployment. Psychological volatility within acceptable mission parameters. She read it 3 times. Then she opened the attached personnel files, and for the first time in 22 years of processing military transfer documents, Vel Soren's secondary respiratory system simply stopped cycling. The war against the Keth Dominion had been going badly for 11 months. Not catastrophically, the coalition still held its core systems, still maintained supply lines, still projected enough unified force that the Keth hadn't pushed past the outer threshold. But badly enough that the Emergency Council had done something it had never done before in 400 years of interstellar governance. It had sent a formal request to Earth. Not an invitation, not a diplomatic overture, a request, bordering on something the Council's language protocols couldn't quite classify as begging because no such category existed in their documentation systems. The Keth had a weapon, a bioengineered atmospheric processor they called the asterisk hollowing, and it was doing exactly what the name implied to every world it touched. The coalition had lost 3 planets in 8 months, not conquered, hollowed. Left as sterile rock, the atmosphere stripped in under 72 hours, every living thing reduced to organic sediment. The coalition needed soldiers who could fight inside the hollowing's deployment window, inside the 72 hours, in atmosphere that was already becoming toxic, against Keth ground forces that wore sealed combat suits and had no reason to hurry, because they knew they had always known, that no rational species would keep fighting in conditions that guaranteed death. Humanity had been a coalition member for 60 years, a minor member, a young species technologically promising, occasionally useful, reliably strange. Their military contributions had been modest, their casualties carefully managed, their commanders thoughtful and measured. The coalition's tactical analysts had a working file on human warfare doctrine and had classified it as asterisk competent, conventional, unremarkable. The request had been straightforward. Earth, please send soldiers. The coalition will provide full environmental suits and atmospheric shielding. We need bodies willing to fight in extremely difficult conditions for 30 to 40 hours. Earth had responded within 6 hours. We will send what you need. Please prepare medical facilities for the receiving units upon return. The designation is Project Lazarus, Cohort 7. Transit time, 14 days. The Council had been relieved. Vel Soren had been the one to receive the follow-up transmission 3 days before the transport arrived, the one that contained the personnel files, the one with the misapplied classification stamp. She pulled up the first name on the manifest. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, age 34, previous deployments 6, injuries sustained across career, compound fractures in both legs reconstructed, left eye replacement synthetic, hearing loss partial right ear uncompensated by request. The phrase asterisk uncompensated by request had a footnote. The footnote said, Soldier declined neurological correction as partial hearing loss does not impair battlefield effectiveness, and soldier reports it creates useful sensory asymmetry in close quarters environments. Vel Soren didn't know what sensory asymmetry meant in a combat context. She moved to the next file. Corporal James Ockhaffer. Age, 27. Psychological evaluation, chronic hypervigilance managed, sleep architecture, non-standard, cycles of 90-minute intervals rather than consolidated rest, possible post-traumatic adaptation. Note from supervising physician. Soldier's anomalous sleep pattern appears to be a self-trained response to extended operations environments. Recommend no pharmaceutical correction. Asset in field conditions. Asset. They had written *asset to describe a young man who had trained himself to never fully sleep. She opened the third file, then the fourth. Then she stopped opening individual files and simply looked at the total count. 216 personnel. She cross-referenced against the Coalition's standard combat unit sizing for operations of the requested type. The standard was 1,200 soldiers, minimum, for a 72-hour contested environment action. Earth had sent 216. Her superior, Fleet Admiral Orendast, was standing behind her now. She hadn't heard him approach. "How many did they send?" he asked. 216. A pause. "There must be additional transports following." "There are no additional transports." The silence between them lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted because she was the kind of person who counted things during moments of confusion, because numbers felt reliable when everything else didn't. "Vel Soren," the Admiral said carefully, "the contested zone requires minimum 1,200. I know what it requires." Did they misunderstand the scale of the operation? She pulled up the original request, then Earth's response, then the follow-up confirmation. Every number had been explicit, every parameter clearly communicated. The Coalition had even translated the casualty projection into human mortality statistics and sent those along, because they wanted to be respectful of humanity's smaller population base. Earth's acknowledgement of the casualty projection was still in the file. It said "understood, proceed with current deployment numbers." "They understood," she said. The Admiral was quiet for a long moment. "Then what," he said, "exactly did they send us?" The transport docked at Station Meridian 9 on a Tuesday, which meant nothing to anyone aboard the station except the 6 human administrative staff who had been stationed there for the last 3 years, and who had, apparently, been quietly informed that the transport was coming. Vel Soren watched from the observation deck as the first units disembarked. She had been told to expect soldiers. She had been told they would be in standard transit configuration, light personal gear, sidearms holstered, equipment packed. She had reviewed enough human military deployments to know what to expect. Humans in transit mode were often loud, frequently informal, occasionally disruptive to station protocols in ways that were more amusing than concerning. The first soldier through the airlock was a woman, small by human standards, which still made her approximately the same height as a mid-sized Coalition species. She wore no visible armor, carried a pack that looked too light for a 72-hour contested environment. She stopped just past the airlock threshold, looked up not forward, not around, but up asterisk at the ceiling of the docking bay, and stood completely still for approximately 3 seconds. Then she looked directly at Vel Soren. Vel Soren was on an observation deck 40 meters above. She should not have been visible from that angle. She certainly should not have been the specific focus of a soldier who had just stepped off a 14-day transit. The woman Vasquez, Vel Soren realized, because the manifest said Vasquez was leading the advance element, held eye contact for 1 second, then looked away, like she'd filed the information and moved on. The rest of the unit came through after her. They were quiet. Not the quiet of exhausted transit passengers, not the quiet of soldiers waiting for orders. It was a different quiet, the kind that had shape to it. "They don't talk," the Admiral murmured beside her. "They're talking," Vel Soren said. She pointed. The soldiers were communicating, but barely, small gestures, abbreviated signals, A look held a fraction of a second longer than normal. A full communication system operating below the threshold of casual observation. She'd read about this in the psychological profiles. Non-verbal tactical shorthand, developed through extended high-noise operational environments where verbal communication creates targeting vulnerability. They had developed a secret language made of glances. "Why aren't they in armor?" the Admiral asked. Velsorin checked the manifest again. The Coalition had provided full atmospheric suits for the operation. Standard issue, rated for the Hollowing's projected toxicity levels. 14 days ago, those suits had been loaded onto the transport at the handoff point. She looked at the soldiers moving across the docking bay below. None of them were wearing the suits. "Find out what happened to the equipment," the Admiral said. It took 40 minutes. The suits were found in the transport's lower cargo hold, still in their original shipping containers, unopened. The Admiral sent a liaison to speak with Vasquez directly. She requested a transcript of the exchange. It arrived 20 minutes later. Liaison, Sergeant Vasquez, the atmospheric suits provided for this operation were found unused in cargo storage. Were there issues with the equipment? Vasquez, no issues, good suits. We reviewed the specs. Liaison, you chose not to use them. Vasquez, we reviewed the specs. Liaison, I'm not certain I understand the distinction, Sergeant. Vasquez, the suits are rated for approximately 40 hours in the projected atmospheric degradation curve. We're planning to be in environment for 68 hours. Liaison, the operation window is 72 hours. You would have. Vasquez, we'd have the suits fail in the last 32 hours. That's worse than not having them. We'd be managing suit failure and operational objectives simultaneously. Liaison, Sergeant, without atmospheric protection, human physiology cannot. Vasquez, can I ask you something? Liaison, of course. Vasquez, how many people have you lost to the Hollowing so far? Liaison, across 3 worlds approximately. Vasquez, I don't need the number. I need to know if any of them were in suits. Pause in the transcript, 5 seconds, noted by the liaison's recording system. Liaison, yes, the soldiers on the 3rd world were all in atmospheric suits. Vasquez, and the suits failed in the last phase of the hollowing cycle. Liaison, that is correct. Vasquez, then we know what happens with suits in the late cycle. We don't know what happens without them. Liaison, Sergeant, what happens without them is that you die. Vasquez, maybe, but maybe we do something useful first. End transcript. Velsorin read it twice. Then she forwarded it to the Admiral with a single line of her own. I believe the classification error on the original manifest was not a clerical mistake. He replied within seconds, explain. She typed, they weren't misfiled as medical transport. They were correctly filed. The humans just use a different definition of medicine. The briefing happened in the station's primary tactical theater, and Velsorin attended as official observer, which gave her a seat in the elevated rear gallery and an unobstructed view of both the holographic display and the humans arranged below it. They sat differently than Coalition soldiers, not slumped, the opposite, a kind of deliberate stillness that looked like relaxation but registered to her secondary sensory cluster as something coiled. Every one of them was tracking the room, multiple sight lines, offset to cover blind angles. They had arranged themselves, she realized, so that no more than 2 of them faced the same direction simultaneously. They'd walked into an unfamiliar briefing room and automatically formed a defensive perimeter, without being told to, without apparently thinking about it. Fleet Commander Rethadun ran the briefing. He was a good commander, clear, specific, tactically sophisticated. He explained the hollowing mechanism, the Keth ground force disposition, the atmospheric degradation curve, the 3 target installations the Coalition needed destroyed to collapse the hollowing deployment before it reached full saturation on the 4th world, Peladar. Peladar had a population of 900 million. Vasquez sat in the front row. She asked exactly 3 questions during the 90-minute briefing. First, what's the wind pattern in the installation corridors during late atmospheric degradation? Second, do the Keth remove their dead, or do they leave them? Third, after a long pause near the end, very quietly, how many people have you tried to evacuate from Peladar? Rethadun looked at her. We've evacuated approximately 12 million. The transit infrastructure cannot. How many are left? 888 million. Vasquez nodded once, like she was adding something to an internal equation, and didn't ask another question. The briefing ended. The humans filed out. Velsorin stayed in her seat for a long time afterward, looking at the holographic display which was still showing Peladar. A blue-green world, oceans, visible cloud cover, 900 million people who had been born there and assumed they would die there under entirely different circumstances. She thought about the question Vasquez had asked. How many people have you tried to evacuate? Not can they be saved, not what's the evacuation timeline, not is there another option. Just how many have you tried to save, past tense, already accepting the math. She thought about the personnel files. The injuries declined to be corrected. The sleep cycles trained into something useful, the language made of glances. She thought about the word monsters, which appeared exactly once in all of Earth's documentation, in an internal memo that had been accidentally included in the transfer packet. A memo from Earth's own military oversight board, approving Project Lazarus Cohort 7 for deployment. The memo had said, "We will send what the galaxy asked for. We will send heroes. We acknowledge that in order to create heroes capable of this specific task, we first had to create something else. The Ethical Review Board is satisfied that the program outcomes, while ethically uncomfortable, fall within the bounds of informed volunteer service. The subjects know what they are. They volunteered anyway." She had almost dismissed that memo as bureaucratic noise when she first read it. The subjects know what they are. What were they? She got part of an answer 4 hours before deployment, and it came from the unlikeliest possible source. Corporal James Okafor, the one who'd trained himself not to sleep, was sitting alone in the station's secondary observation bay, which was technically restricted, but apparently no one had told him that, or he decided the restriction didn't apply to him, which seemed consistent with everything else she'd observed. She almost turned around. Instead, she walked to the viewport beside him and stood there. He didn't look at her. He was watching the stars. "Can't sleep?" she asked. It was a stupid thing to say. She knew from his file that sleep wasn't really the right word for what he did. "I don't really sleep," he said. "Not in a row, 90 minutes on then up then 90 minutes, old habit." "Your file says it might be a trauma response." "My file says a lot of things." He paused. "Is it a trauma response if you trained yourself into it? If you decided the nightmares were less important than staying alive, and you restructured your whole sleep cycle around that decision, consciously, over 3 years?" Velsorin didn't have an answer to that. "We're not broken," Okafor said, still watching the stars. "That's what you're wondering, whether we're broken, whether Earth sent you damaged people because they didn't have anything better." "I wasn't thinking that." "You were thinking it a little." There was no accusation in his voice, just accuracy. "The answer is that we're not broken. Broken things don't work anymore. We work. We just work differently than you expected." "What happened to you?" she asked. And then, because she realized that was the wrong question, "What did the program do?" He was quiet for a long time. "You know the thing about humans that most species don't understand," he said finally. "We adapt, not just physically, not just cognitively. We adapt ** emotionally. We take a feeling that was supposed to stop us, fear, pain, grief, the knowledge of our own death, and we can, if we choose, over a long time with a lot of help and a lot of failure, recategorize it. Recategorize it as what? Information. He turned to look at her then. His eyes were clear, calm in a way that was somehow more unnerving than distress would have been. Pain tells you something is wrong or something is important or you're still alive. If you can feel it without needing to stop it, it becomes data. Project Lazarus didn't remove our fear. It didn't remove our pain tolerance. It taught us to use them without being controlled by them. Velsorin absorbed this. "What does that feel like?" she said. "From the inside." He considered the question seriously. "You know what it feels like," he said. "It feels like being very, very awake." She left him there, watching the stars, in 90-minute cycles that he'd trained himself to call rest. The deployment window opened at 400 station time. She watched from tactical monitoring, all 216. They went in through 3 insertion vectors simultaneously, timed to the hollowing's natural atmospheric turbulence cycle, which Vasquez had apparently spent the entire transit calculating. The suits were still in cargo. They brought weapons, a shared medical kit that was far smaller than any standard field allocation, and each other. The first 6 hours, the tactical feeds showed exactly what Velsorin had feared. The hollowing's early phase was already in progress on Peladar's third continent. Atmospheric toxicity at 22% of lethal threshold and climbing. Keth ground forces moving in coordinated sweeps, confident, unhurried. 3 installations active. The humans made contact with Keth forces at Installation 1 at Hour 2. The feed fragmented. The Keth used a signal disruption field as standard doctrine. Velsorin got imagery in broken pieces, 30-second windows, corrupted, then dark, then a sudden return. What she saw in those windows didn't make tactical sense. The humans weren't advancing on the installation. They were retreating, or not retreating, dispersing, scattering in what the tactical AI initially classified as asterisk route, then reclassified as asterisk unknown pattern, then gave up classifying entirely and simply marked as non-standard. Admiral Orendast, standing beside her, exhaled slowly. "They're running." "They're not running," Velsorin said. She didn't know why she was certain, she just was. "The Keth forward element is reporting 0 resistance at Installation 1, the comms officer said. "They're reporting the humans fled." "Then the installation." "Still standing, yes." Velsorin stared at the map. The humans were gone from Installation 1, dispersed into the surrounding terrain. The Keth had declared the area secure and were pulling their reinforcements to assist with the hollowing progression. Installation 1 went dark 4 hours later. Not a weapons strike, not a frontal assault. Something had been done to it internally, quietly, in the 40-minute window after the Keth declared it secure and stopped watching it carefully. Velsorin pulled every available sensor reading and still couldn't reconstruct the mechanism. She found a partial answer in Vasquez's mission log, transmitted in a burst when atmospheric conditions briefly allowed. Keth removed their dead, left the installation to collect casualties from outer perimeter. Window, 40 Min Akafer team went in through decontamination intake. Done. They had made the Keth create the opening by pretending to run. And the Keth hadn't questioned it because every model they had of enemy behavior said that rational species, when outgunned, retreat. Humans had retreated, the Keth had been right. The Keth had also been catastrophically wrong. Hour 18. Atmospheric toxicity at 61% of lethal threshold. Velsorin had stopped going to her quarters. She was running on stimulants and a deep, clarifying dread that kept the exhaustion at bay through sheer biochemistry. Installation 2 fell at hour 19. The mechanism this time was different. She couldn't reconstruct it at all. The only data point was that the Keth reinforcement element that had been positioned to defend it reported, for 11 minutes, that they were taking heavy fire from 3 simultaneous directions, and then stopped reporting anything. 216 soldiers, no atmospheric protection, in 61% lethal air, had suppressed a Keth reinforcement element of 400. Suppressed, not destroyed, not overwhelmed, not annihilated. The word the Keth after-action report used, once those reports began filtering through captured channels, was suppressed in the sense of they were there, and then they were not there, and we do not know where they went. Admiral Orendast had gone quiet in a way that Velsoren recognized as the specific quiet of someone, revising their fundamental assumptions. Velsoren, he said. Yes. The casualty projections we sent to Earth for this operation. 80 to 95% attrition, yes. Did the humans believe our projections were accurate? Their acknowledgement said understood. And they sent 216 people. Yes. A longer pause. Why 216 specifically, he said. Why not 200, why not 250? She had thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since the manifest arrived. I think, she said carefully, that 216 is the number they calculated they needed, not the number they were comfortable losing. The number they needed, accounting for expected attrition, to complete all 3 installation objectives with a residual operational element capable of withdrawal. He stared at her. They did the math, she said. They ran the casualty projections themselves. They calculated how many people they'd lose at each installation, and then they sent exactly the number required so that someone would still be standing at the end. He stopped. Yes, she said. How many do we have left? She looked at the tracking data, at the 73 life sign transponders still active. 73, she said, and they're moving toward installation 3. 73 people, in air that was already killing them, moving toward the last target with the same methodical, unhurried purpose they'd carried through the airlock 14 hours ago. The Admiral put his hands flat on the console. Send a recall order, he said. They've done enough, 2 installations. The hollowing will be slowed significantly. We can work with. They won't come back, Velsoren said. They will if ordered. Sir, she pulled up the last communication from Vasquez, sent at hour 16. Read the last line. He read it. The last line said, we know the math, don't send the recall. This is what we came for. The tactical feed for installation 3 came back at hour 26, briefly, in a 40-second window. What Velsoren saw in those 40 seconds she would spend the next 11 years attempting to accurately describe, in reports, in testimony, in the quiet of her own memory, and she would always feel that language was insufficient. 73 humans, in air that their biology was not designed to process, moving through a Keth-held installation as if the toxicity were a weather condition rather than a death sentence. She could see them in the thermal imaging, small heat signatures, moving fast, covering each other in the practiced shorthand of people who had learned to function with fear as data rather than command. She could see the gaps where the heat signatures had been. At the start of hour 26, she could count 51. By the 40-second mark, 44. The feed went dark. She sat in the silence of the tactical room and listened to the Admiral breathing and waited. It took 6 more hours. At hour 32, a single transmission came through on the emergency frequency. 1 sentence. Installation 3 is offline. The hollowing is stopped. Peladar is clear. And then a second line, which Velsoren had not expected, which she read 3 times to make sure her translation matrix hadn't made an error. We'd like a ride home, please, whoever's still able to ask. 38 survivors. 38 out of 216. They came off the recovery transport at Station Meridian 9 hours later. Vel Soren was at the airlock when they docked. She didn't know why. She hadn't planned to be there. She simply found herself standing at the airlock at the time the transport arrived, which she supposed was its own kind of answer. They came through in groups, some walking, some carried, all of them wearing the particular expression that she had no category for, and had been trying to name since the first moment Vasquez had looked up at her from the docking bay floor. That expression that was not triumph, not exhaustion, not grief exactly, but something that partook of all three and resolved into something quieter and stranger than any of them. Vasquez was forth through the airlock. She was walking, but her left arm was in a brace that was clearly field-improvised, strips of equipment webbing, and what looked like part of a weapon stock. She had a burn across the left side of her face that was going to take significant reconstruction. Her right eye, the synthetic one, had a cracked lens and was flickering at irregular intervals, which gave her a disconcerting strobe-like quality in the station lighting. She stopped when she saw Vel Soren. "Archivist," she said. "Sergeant," Vel Soren replied, and then, because nothing else was adequate, because every protocol phrase she knew felt like an insult to the moment, "Peladar is clear." Vasquez nodded. 900 million people, Vel Soren said. "Yeah. That was what you were counting." Vasquez looked at her for a long moment, the flickering synthetic eye, the quiet that had shape to it. "We were always counting," Vasquez said. "That's all we were ever doing, counting what we had against what was needed and deciding the math was acceptable." A pause. "Don't make us heroes, we're not heroes." "What are you?" Vasquez started walking again, past her, toward the medical facility. "People who decided," she said, without turning around, "that the number on the other side of the math was worth more than the number on our side." HFY came through last. He was being carried by two others, both of whom looked barely capable of carrying anything, but managed it with the focused determination that seemed to be the only setting these people had. He was conscious. His eyes were open. When he passed Vel Soren, he turned his head and looked at her, and he almost smiled. She thought about what he'd said, about being very, very awake. She thought about what it must be like to be trained into that state, to have taken every ordinary human response to suffering and fear and transformed it, deliberately over years, into something that could be pointed at an impossible problem and simply continue. She thought about the memo. The subjects know what they are. They volunteered anyway. She thought about the word in the title she'd seen in the original deployment authorization, the word that had made her pause even before she opened the files, the word that Earth had chosen, and the Coalition had briefly misread as a translation error. The Coalition had assumed * monsters was a mistranslation, a cultural artifact, an error in the language matrix. It was not a mistranslation. Earth had known exactly what Project Lazarus built. The Ethical Review Board had been uncomfortable with it. The soldiers had been informed of it. They had looked at what the program had made of them. The recategorized pain, the weaponized fear, the sleep they'd broken into 90-minute windows, the injuries they'd declined to repair, the language made of glances, the math they'd done in full knowledge of what the answer meant for themselves, and they had said yes anyway. Because somewhere on Peladar, 900 million people were alive. The report Vel Soren filed took 3 days to write. The Emergency Council read it in closed session. She received no formal response. What she received instead, 6 weeks later, was an indirect communication through 3 layers of administrative routing, the kind of careful distance that institutions maintained when they wanted to respond to something without creating a record of their response, asking whether, in her professional assessment, humanity could be prevailed upon to create more such units. She sat with that communication for a long time. Then she wrote back, "I will ask, but you should understand something first. What Earth sent was not a weapon they built casually. It was not a program they implemented without cost. The 38 people who came back from Peladar will spend years in reconstruction, physical and otherwise. The 178 who didn't come back chose not to come back with full knowledge of that choice. Earth will need time before they can do this again, and they will need a reason they consider sufficient. 900 million people was sufficient. You should be asking yourself what number is sufficient to you, and whether you're comfortable knowing that somewhere on Earth there are people doing the same math, and their answer is different from yours. She sent it. She never received a reply. What she received instead was a secondary communication from the Terran Coordination Bureau, 9 months later, routed through the same standard channels as the original manifest. Correct classification stamped this time. No footnotes, no memos, no accidentally included internal documents. Just a name, Project Lazarus Cohort 8, transfer manifest to follow. She pulled up the manifest. 312 personnel. Deployed to the outer threshold, where the Keth had apparently reconsidered the terms of their hollowing campaign after Peladar, and decided that whatever was on the other side of that math wasn't worth the arithmetic. The manifest had a note in the remarks field, which was not standard form for military transfer documentation. It said, the Keth have asked through diplomatic channels what kind of species sends soldiers without armor into a dying atmosphere for people they've never met. We told them the truth. We don't know either. We've never been able to fully explain it. We just know they keep volunteering. Velsorin read that last line a long time. She thought about Vasquez walking back through the airlock with a borrowed arm brace, and a cracked eye and 900 million people's continued existence in the place where her fear used to live. She thought about Akafar, watching stars in 90-minute intervals, telling her what it felt like to recategorize suffering into information. She thought about what the galaxy had asked for and what Earth had decided to send instead, and she understood, in the way that realization settles rather than strikes, that there was no distinction. The galaxy had asked for heroes. Earth had looked at what heroes actually required, the math, the cost, the arithmetic of lives against lives, and had produced the only thing capable of volunteering for that math and surviving long enough to complete it. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most advanced. Just the only species in the known galaxy that could look at a 95% casualty projection, do the numbers, decide the numbers were acceptable, and walk through an airlock without their armor on, into poisoned air, toward 3 targets that needed to stop existing, for 900 million people who would never know their names. The Keth had asked what kind of species sent soldiers like that. The answer was not a comfortable one, and it was not meant to be. It was the kind of answer that lived in your secondary respiratory system long after you first encountered it, in a misfiled transfer manifest, in a classification stamp that wasn't wrong, in a footnote that said asterisk psychological volatility within acceptable mission parameters asterisk, and in the quiet, terrible accuracy of the word a species had chosen for its own program, not as condemnation, not as horror, but as simple, unflinching description of what they had made. And what they had made of themselves and what they would continue to make, because the galaxy kept asking, and the math kept needing to be done, and somewhere on Earth there were still people willing to do it. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were the species willing to continue long after every rational civilization would have stopped, because they had looked at what stopping cost, and decided, quietly, in the language of glances and 90-minute sleeps and injuries left unrepaired, that the price of stopping was the one price they refused to pay.